Good evening all, I'm Aditi Lamba and this is Thursday night's Vision of Asia. Welcome to our South Asian news segment, coming to you from our studio located here in Astoria, New York. Beginning the episode, here's what's happening all across. More than 7.4 million cases have been confirmed of the novel coronavirus with at least 417,000 deaths. In the United States, the number of cases has now surpassed 2 million with more than 113,000 deaths. Since reopening, a dozen states are seeing a rise in COVID-19 hospitalizations as some states ask hospitals to activate emergency plan. Health experts are also warning about another surge in cases as lockdown restrictions loosen up. Europe could face a second surge of COVID-19 infections in the coming weeks as mass protests in the continent continue to follow the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which has sparked a global outpouring of grief and protests worldwide for the last many days. Here, in a response, cities and municipalities across the U.S. are starting to ban or have banned the use of chokeholds in policing in Phoenix, Los Angeles, Sacramento, Miami, Washington, D.C., New York City, Minneapolis, and many more. In another response, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has renewed her call for the removal of 11 statues of representing Confederate soldiers and officials that are on display in the United States Capitol. We continue today to discuss much on these demonstrations and the impact of systemic racism and anti-blackness in our communities and institutions. Along with that, we have tonight more on South Asian cultural heritage and its ancient benefits, something that could be useful during this pandemic. Let's begin with the headlines. Dr. Kanchan Koya on the cookbook Spice Spice Baby and Ancient Spices, New York. Suma Raghunathan on systemic racism, police brutality, and anti-blackness, New York City. Leah Thachil discusses George Floyd's systemic oppression in South Asian Americans, New York City. It's time for a short break. Stay with us in Vision of Asia. Voice of the Community will be back shortly. Welcome back. I'm Aditi Lamba and this is Vision of Asia. Beginning the episode, we are presenting more perspectives in the case of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. Demands for police reform continue to grow in Minnesota and across the country, where Mr. Floyd's death has brought attention to the issues of anti-blackness, racism, and police brutality. Cities like Los Angeles and New York have now said that they will cut millions of dollars in police funding and look forward to a reform. This is all happening as anti-racist protests continue across the nation, demanding for a change which protects minority communities. But what is the issue of anti-blackness or systemic racism, and how does this relate to police brutality? We spoke with expert on politics and policy, Leah Thachil. Bringing in much insight, Leah shared her opinions on the role and responsibility of the South Asian American community in the cause of Black Lives Matter. Addressing the history of South Asians in the United States, Leah shared facts and figures and urged all to advocate their voice and to exercise the right to vote in order to bring social justice and equality. Here is Leah Thachil.
Great. I want to start at the very beginning, and which that is, let's define what anti-blackness is. I recently read this wonderful New York Times article, and the authors so very powerfully put it, and anti-blackness in a sentence is the inability to recognize Black humanity. And to break it down even further, it means it's the inability within us to see Black people as humans. So when we see the murder of George Floyd, where a white police officer thought nothing of keeping his neck and using his body weight to suffocate a Black man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we're seeing a glaring example of anti-Blackness because he didn't see George Floyd's humanity in that moment. He just saw a Black man, and to him that didn't equate as a human. So if I were to give you a more academic definition, I'd like to quote a Malayali American professor, Professor Thomas George, who says that anti-Blackness is both the covert and overt, also the institutional and interpersonal racism that negatively affects the health, the wealth, and the safety of African Americans. What this really means is that African Americans consistently in this country, they are not safe. They cannot garner wealth like we can. They cannot ensure their health the same way we can. They're already born into this country facing unequal odds. And I say this all to say is that it's so deeply ingrained within us as a country, this anti-Blackness. It's within our systems. Just to read a few stats, 90% of the wealth in this country is concentrated with white people. The income gap between a Black household and a white household is roughly the same today as it was in 1970. So when we look at history, in 1965 is when the Civil Rights Act, or I'm sorry, 1964 is when the Civil Rights Act passed. And that's when African American people were finally given equal rights in this country. But when we look at the whole of history, for 250 years, African American people were enslaved in this country. And then for 100 years after that, when they were emancipated from slavery, they were then faced with Jim Crow laws, which led to segregation. And then it was only in 1965 that they even got full equal rights and the ability to vote. So when we look at all of that, in the entire history of this country, Black people really have only had equal rights. And I put that in quote because, as we know, they don't get to enjoy those equal rights to the same extent as others in our society for about 56 years. That's a very short time frame, right? So there's a lot of work to be done to sort of dismantle anti-Blackness in our country and in our institution. When you look at the stats, just maternal mortality rates in this country, Black mothers are 3.5 times more likely to die during childbirth than white mothers. There's about 13% of the American population is African American men, but they make up 40% of our prison population. There's mass incarceration, there's unhealthy standards that they're all facing. And it is part of the institution, and it's very difficult for us to sort of confront it, but we have to, especially the South Asian community. What, we fail to recognize is our own history in this country. Most South Asian Americans came to this country in 1965 or post 1965, all due to one piece of legislation, which was the Immigration Act of 1965. Right. My family was a direct beneficiary of this law. A lot of families can trace back their beginnings in this country to this law, and it was specifically passed to allow highly educated or highly skilled South Asian Americans into this country. And it was only allowed because of the civil rights movement. What a lot of people don't even know is that South Asians have been in America since the 1800s. There's been documented Punjabi immigrants, traders, people that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in the 1920s, the American population was really, really troubled by the presence of South Asians in their country. It was so troubled to the point that it passed the Immigration Act of 1917, which, and I would like to quote it verbatim, said that Indians and those of Indian descent were deemed undesirable to achieve American citizenship. Wow. It was a piece of legislation in this country, which you can look up on any, forum. But that is, in and of itself, shows that we weren't wanted here. We weren't wanted here until we served a purpose. And that's what the Immigration Act of 1965 did. It gave us a purpose. So it brought over highly skilled engineers, highly skilled doctors. My mom came because of the nursing shortage that this country experienced during the 70s, 80s, as did my husband's aunt, and by them coming and then chain migration, they were able to bring their families over. It was all designed, right? It was especially designed. But when we came here in 1965, We came here being able to exercise our full rights. We never experienced segregation. You and I both didn't. Our parents didn't. They don't know what that's like. And the only reason that they didn't is because Black people took it upon themselves to do that fight and get equality for all people of color, not just themselves. So we have a huge duty and obligation as a community to support African American people and to understand their plight. Our country was colonized by the British for 200 years. We were looted, our resources were taken. I mean, tea was taken from us, pepper, textiles. A lot of things were taken from us from the British. So we should understand more acutely how it feels for an African American who came to this country not by choice.
Right.
They were brought here as slaves. Their ancestors were brought here against their will. They were torn away from their homes. We know what it's like to live in our motherland as second-class citizens. My grandparents remember what that was like. Our great-grandparents, most of our grandparents can tell us about British Raj, and they know how terrible it was. So we have a history of understanding, oppression, and it is our job to, fight for that. So systemic racism essentially is talking about policies that prevent equality. So there are very clear policies, and I'm going to use the police as an example, as to why there is systemic racism. Essentially, the way the structure of our institutions have been made, it skews the ability of African Americans to be on equal footing. So when we look at the rates at which African American people are killed by the police, just to name more stats, I'm a stats gal, what can I say? From 2013 to 2019, 1,840 Black people have been killed by the police.
Yeah.
Of the police that have committed this murder, these acts, only 1% have received any punishment. That means 99% of the cops that, killed unarmed Black people faced no consequences. And that is due to a policy. That is due to protocol and systems that don't take into account that this level of brutality, this level of violence is not necessary.
Continuing our report following the outrage after the death of George Floyd, we have now another segment of our recent conversation featuring independent strategist and expert in immigrant rights and racial justice, Suman Raghunathan. Yesterday, George Floyd's brother testified before the House of Representatives on police accountability, calling on lawmakers to overhaul policing laws. He said his brother didn't deserve to die over a $20 bill. Suman spoke to us on police accountability and on the change that is being demanded all across the nation through these protests and what defunding of the police means. Also presenting her views on the White House response to George Floyd's case, Suman Raghunathan urged viewers to take a stand and stand up against inequality and injustice, addressing the needed change in legislation and all three levels of the government. She also urged all to vote in the ongoing primaries as well as in November.
I continue to be disappointed at the response of the president as well as the White House with respect to the uprisings and the ways that the president as well as his supporters in the White House have continued to fan the flames of violence. When you have a sitting president who references the words of a brutal police chief from the 1970s who vowed, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, you have an individual who is not working to calm down a powder keg of a situation across the country. You have someone who is choosing explicitly to pit residents against each other, which is not a course of action or words that will do anything to help defuse the high emotions and sentiments that are coming across the country. What is clear to me is that this administration, both via its actions, its statements, as well as its policies, does not care at all about ending police brutality, about ending systemic racism, or really about the lives that have been lost when you have the current president indicating that a peaceful protester who was 75 years old in Buffalo, New York, pushed himself to in turn sustain a critical injury at the hands of police. I see yet another incident of blaming the victim of a tragic, violent incident. And I know that our nation deserves better, and that our whole set of residents across the country and really the world also deserves better.
You know, Simon, in the South Asian community, there is a sense of anti-Blackness, and apparently there is a lack of understanding of their own history of being a model minority. I think this is a good part in the interview for us to have a little discussion on that and your comments on that. How prevalent is this issue, and how important is it for us to right now discuss that there is anti-Blackness issue in the community, in which we have to educate and raise awareness so that, you know, we can understand that this issue just doesn't impact Black lives, it impacts all lives, all brown and Black communities.
I think this is a moment of deep reflection and a real opportunity for South Asians to be able to really understand, even from a historical perspective, the ways that South Asians have been pitted against very explicitly Black individuals and communities. I think it's important also for us to understand that we in our own community often hold very deep-seated feelings of anti-Blackness and are often very quick to distance ourselves from Black individuals and from Black communities, and that continues to play into the rules of an explicitly white supremacist agenda. White supremacists want South Asians to believe that we are slightly better than Black folks, but they will never consider us their equals. And the level of violence that has been aimed against South Asians and Blacks is not equal. The level of violence and the murders of Black individuals in this country does not so greatly exceeds the level of violence that has been engineered against South Asians. And yet at the same time, we do have instances where we have an understanding of how anti-Blackness manifests in violence against ourselves. We have, the incident a few years ago in Alabama, where an elderly South Asian man who was visiting from India was seen as Black by white local police officers, was not able to make himself understood to them, was brutalized by them, and in turn ended up paralyzed. So I think we need to have more introspection and wake-up calls in our own communities about our own sentiments and ideas around anti-Blackness, and how we need to disrupt those ideas and truly actually take a stand, not just for our lives, but actually for Black lives. When India was on the precipice of its independence struggle, Black leaders from the US went to South Africa and then to India to build solidarity and to meet with Gandhi. And we need to have that reciprocity actually continue now for us to have an even greater force to really truly show up for the protection of Black lives across this country. Because, as my friend Linda Sarsour and so many others say, we will only be free once our Black brothers and sisters are free. And I truly believe that. And I think the events of the last 2 months have only shown to reinforce that.
And it's time for another short break on Vision of Asia, Voice of the Community. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Vision of Asia, Voice of the Community, and I am Aditi Lamba. Now, bringing in a conversation on South Asian culture and heritage, we have another segment of our conversation with author of the cookbook, Spice Spice Baby, Dr. Kanchan Koya. A molecular biologist and a spice enthusiast, Dr. Kanchan Koya has created a platform which dives into demystifying Asian spices and raises awareness on the healing potential of spices and how to incorporate them. Sharing 100 recipes, the book brings in a universal approach, blending them into all cuisines and types of food with much on educating all on a science-based evidence on these health benefits. Dr. Koya also provided some key tips on health and wellness, especially during this tough time period. A very positive and hopeful discussion on sustaining good health. Here is Dr. Kanchan Koya on Spice Baby. If you had any advice for South Asian American parents, especially in terms of building nutrition and immunity for their children, what would you tell them?
I would say if we go back to our Indian food basics,
Right.
so our traditional Indian diet is actually one of the healthiest in the world, right? It's packed with plant-based foods, which the research tells us over and over again. Whether you look at cultures that enjoy exceptional longevity around the world, that are disease-free, plant-based foods are the dominant food on the plate. And the traditional Indian diet is predominantly plant-based. Even if you occasionally enjoy your meat curry or whatever, every Indian knows the traditional Indian plate is very, very heavy on plants, whether it's the dal and the lentils, the beans, the vegetables, usually multiple kinds, the whole grain, homemade, handmade rotis. So I always say, go back to the basics, go back to the simple peasant foods. That's where the healing lies. What gets us into trouble is the processed foods that have become associated with modernization, coolness. There's room for that. Like, you can eat 20% of your diet can be that.
Yeah.
If 80% of your diet is real, whole, unadulterated, simple, ancestral peasant food, you're going to win.
For sure. I also would like to reflect upon this NGO that you're working with, who is also benefiting a lot of underserved communities in India. I think that's such a wonderful thing to do, to attach yourself with a nonprofit association as well. I'd love for you to reflect on that, because I know a certain percentage goes to that.
Yes, so we donate a percentage of book sales to Sneha, which is the NGO that we partnered with in India. They're doing important work around malnutrition in urban slums. And, I grew up in India. I live here now, and I'm very fortunate. But I'm also very sensitive to the fact that while we here in the West talk about chronic diseases like diabetes and inflammation and heart disease, which are really diseases of too much food and too much of the wrong types of food.
Yeah.
There is a big portion of the population in the world, and particularly in India, that suffers from the opposite problem, right? Of malnourishment, especially children. So that irony isn't lost on me, and I wanted to just do my part in a small way. Sneha is amazing. They have partnered with the Gates Foundation. They're very, very, they're very efficiently run, impactful organizations. So it was an honor to partner with them. And I will say that something that I did last year when I went to India, and it's work I'm hoping to continue to do, is more work in urban slums. So in Pune, where I'm from, we actually launched a health and wellness program for mothers and kids, Spice Baby, in collaboration with a local NGO called the Gyan Prakash Foundation. And we're teaching mothers in the slums about the power of their spice box, about the power of the traditional Indian diet when executed properly with a wide variety of different vegetables and lentils and all the spices, to really, really raise a healthier generation.
Let's talk about BuzzFeed real quick here, and your collaboration with Tasty. You're one of the only Indian American chefs there that is bringing a lot of recipes, and it's very your style. It's not just Indian; it's a mix of all of the spices and blending a lot of flavor and culture. Talk to me about that relation you have with them, and what does that mean for you to have a presence of an Indian American in a platform like that?
Oh yeah, it's one of the biggest blessings, one of the biggest door openers that kind of happened for me. So it was about 2 years ago, crazy that it's been 2 years, but about 2 years ago, I got an email from a casting scout at BuzzFeed, and I literally thought it was spam. And at that point, I had just published Spice Baby. I hadn't even been on the Today Show yet. I had just self-published it. I was on Instagram stories, like just kind of talking about my mission, my passion, sharing recipes. And I got this email, which I thought was spam. I was like, what? That's so like out there. But I responded, and it ended up being one of their scouters who was like, oh, we're building a talent bench of external talent, and we'd like to interview you and audition you to be part of our talent bench. kind of creating content for Tasty, bringing your content to Tasty. And if people don't know, listening, Tasty is the largest food network online. It's, I think, currently has like 37 million Instagram followers, 10 million YouTube subscribers, 100 million Facebook followers, like just crazy numbers. So they have managed to really create this like insane digital presence. And so to be auditioned, to be a part of that was like, oh my gosh. So I went through the steps, I went through the audition, I had to cook. I had to do like a Food Network style, like walk in, see some ingredients, make a dish on camera, and kind of interview and answer questions about my life while I did it. So that was really fun. And yeah, I guess I got the job, whatever that means, So that partnership now is coming up on 2 years, and it's just been amazing, as you can imagine. I mean, they have been incredibly supportive. Their audience is huge. It's a big challenge for me to bring the healthy food message to an audience that is all about like decadent, hedonistic, delicious, like triple fried food, But the audience is also huge. So there are people who are health conscious and want to make healthier food delicious. So it's been really fun to take my message and kind of bring it to such a big audience.
And this wraps up our show for the night. Remember to send us your suggestions and get your voices and organizations on our show. Email us on events@itvgold.com or follow us on Facebook at itvgold. You can also now subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch many of our popular shows for free. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is Vision of Asia, and I am Aditi Lamba. Take care and be well.